I'd like to talk about the reporting on this problem of the government giving small business contracts to Fortune 500 firms. So the first thing I'd like to establish is the Small Business Act that mandates that small businesses get a minimum of 23% of the total value of all prime contracts each year is the single largest economic stimulus program for the middle class in the history of America. It's much larger than the amount of money the middle class got from TARP or the American Reinvestment Recovery Act. So the Small Business Act is the largest economic stimulus program in history for the middle class. Census Bureau says 28 million small businesses, 98% of all U.S. firms have less than 100 employees, 89% have less than 20, and they're responsible for over half the gross domestic product, half the private sector workforce, over 90% of the net new jobs, and over 90% of U.S. exporters are small businesses. So it's a big deal. But it's almost impossible to get people to write about it. Here's what I've learned. One journalist told me, he said, if you want to put your editor to sleep, talk to him about stories about small businesses. And when you look out there in the mainstream media talking about small businesses, yeah, nobody cares. But they don't realize America's a small business economy. The number one issue, by the way, to American voters is jobs in the economy. Well, when small businesses create over 9% of net new jobs, you kind of can't create jobs without small businesses. So I'm surprised it doesn't get more media coverage. But here's one thing I've come to understand. So when you talk about the Small Business Administration, which is really where all this fraud, abuse, and corruption is going on, there's like 8 guys in the country that report on the SBA. And if you look at what they write, they look like they work for the government. They will not challenge the government. So what's comical is people who make a living by writing about federal small business programs won't mention my name. I've won 30 lawsuits against the government, right? I've got a bigger media footprint on this issue than every other group in the nation combined in a decade, yet the guys in Washington, they won't mention my name, which I find to be, comical. And they can't be real journalists in my view for doing that. But about a year ago, I saw a story to come out, big national story. 38 different journalistic organizations wrote a letter to President Obama asking him to stop politically driven censorship of the media. 38 different journalistic organizations wrote that letter. And when you look at the story, it turns out if you're a journalist in Washington and you write a story that's not flattering to the government, they blacklist you. Think about it, you're a journalist in Washington, maybe your job is to report on the FDA or the SBA or NASA, and if you write a story they don't like, boom, they won't talk to you anymore. Well, you're out of a job. And I've seen that with people. They just won't write about this. And a few weeks after that story came out, another story came out that said 47 inspector generals, many of whom President Obama had appointed, wrote a letter to Congress asking for help that the Obama administration was stonewalling them and not giving them access to information. And it's been reported in the mainstream media, both liberal and conservative media, that the Obama administration is the least transparent administration in history. So it's kind of understandable why this story is not getting the type of coverage it deserves, I think, right? By the way, the fact that it hadn't gotten the kind of coverage it deserves is why it's gone on for 15 years. So the first GAO investigation to the diversion of federal small business contracts to large businesses was based upon FY 2001 data. What's now 2016. That's 15 years. So the reason it's gone on for 15 years is no journalist has ever reported on it sufficiently enough or brought enough attention to force Congress to pass legislation to stop it, right? And it's too bad. So I think this story deserves a lot more attention. And here's some advice to journalists. The government tricks you. I think it was 2 weeks ago, I forgot the guy's name now. Do you remember the guy's name that came out and said the average journalist they talk to is 27, they don't know anything?
Oh, I don't remember that guy.
Yeah, it came out, you probably saw it a couple of weeks ago. Now they're bragging about how they're duping the media and how the journalists know nothing, right? Here's how they've tricked the media. So a journalist will call up the SBA and say, oh, this story came out a report came out that, 151 Fortune 500 firms got small business contracts. The SBA goes this. They go, let me just tell you, that's not true. Those contracts were not set aside for small businesses. They've been tricking journalists with that one for over a decade. Here's what the deal is. Federal law mandates 23% of all contracts go to small businesses. And to inflate that number and fabricate and falsify the government's compliance with those small business contracting goals, they're including billions a month in contracts to Fortune 500 firms and their subsidiaries in that number. But when a journalist talks to them, they'll say, well, those contracts weren't set aside for small businesses. Here's what journalists don't know. There's a federal law that says you can set aside contracts for small business. If you're trying to hit your small business goal and you're going to buy 100 computers, it's called a set aside, a small business set aside, which means you only bid that out to small businesses. It's called set aside contracts. And when the SBA tells some journalists, well, those contracts weren't set aside for small businesses, that's technically true, but they're trying to mislead you. And the truth is those contracts were reported as small business contracts, which means every dollar that went to a Fortune 500 firm they claim went to a small business, a dollar doesn't go to a small business. And they're lying about the fact they're hitting those goals. The other piece of advice I'll give journalists is don't talk to anybody at the SBA in a conference call. They'll get 6, 7 guys in the room, half of them are consultants, and they will just completely, bamboozle you. So if you want to talk about this issue to the SBA, talk to their spokesman, Terry Sutherland, or one other person on the phone. And the last journalist that I talked to that was talking to the SBA was from Public Citizen. And he says they won't answer questions over the phone, they'll only answer written questions. And most recently, when I've seen journalists talk to the SBA, it'll be an unnamed spokesman. Don't do that. By the way, also don't talk to them off the record. So don't talk to them on a conference call. Don't talk to them off the record. And, and don't let them have an unnamed person. Say, what is your name? So I don't ever recall seeing a story, by the way, not in the last decade, where some journalist asked somebody from the SBA a tough question, and then it came out, that so-and-so from the SBA said this, right? You don't see that much. So, we need that. In fact, they need to talk to Maria Contreras-Sweet. Gosh, I don't think I've ever seen anybody, ask her a question. I've never seen them talk to the Inspector General either. So I don't ever recall seeing Pat Gustafson or any other Inspector General quoted in a story about this issue. So, unless some journalist steps up to the plate and talks to someone from the SBA of authority like Maria Contreras-Sweet and asks them some tough questions, this is going to go on for another 15 years, I'm guessing. By the way, there's 3 questions that I've been trying to get some journalists to ask for 15 years. So it's been 15 years. Every year when it comes out that, over 100 Fortune 500 firms got small business contracts, the SBA goes, miscoding, computer glitches, anomalies, simple human error. Not one reporter's ever said, let me ask you a question. So on a federal contract, you're either small or large, kind of like heads or tails, black or white. If these are random errors, half the time an award to a large business would be misreported as a small business contract, and half the time a contract to a small business would be misreported or miscoded as a large business contract. It would cancel itself out like flipping a coin. And not one journalist in 15 years has ever asked anybody from the SBA that question. Not one ever. I'm really waiting for one person to ask somebody that question. The second question is, the SBA said, we have a policy that allows, large corporations to buy a small business, and, and that contract is continue to be reported as a small business contract for the life of the contract, which can be 20 years. No journalist has ever asked the SBA, can you show me the section of the Small Business Act that you use to justify that policy? They can't do it. They can't do it. It's not, the law is just the opposite of that. There's no provision or language in the Small Business Act that would ever allow contracts to Fortune 500 firms or their subsidiaries to be reported as small business contracts. And the last thing I'm waiting for some journalists to do is ask the SBA a question about their exclusionary rule, what they call small business eligible dollars. The Small Business Act clearly states that small business shall receive a minimum of 23% of the total value of all prime contract awards each year. Yet the SBA's come up with this BS policy called the exclusionary rule, where they knock out over half, if not 2/3 of the acquisition budget to fabricate the government's compliance with those goals. That's how they hit the goal, is by making the budget number they use to calculate it, really small, and include billions in contracts to Fortune 500 firms. So, journalists, do me a big favor, ask them 3 questions. Why does miscoding always divert small business contracts to Fortune 500 firms? Can you show me the section of the Small Business Act that's used to justify your exclusionary rule? And show me the section of the Small Business Act that allows you to report awards to Fortune 500 firms and their subsidiaries of small business awards. So, right? No conference calls, and talk to one guy and get their name and put them on the record. It's time for somebody to do that.